A former founding chairman of this subcommittee and a former great prosecutor from the great state of Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I thank the chairman for yielding the time. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this bill. First, I'd like to thank our colleagues for their careful consideration yesterday of the Military Construction Veterans Appropriations Bill, which, as you know, passed overwhelmingly in the House. There were only 4 members who voted against that bill. And I'd like to ask all of the supporters of that bill, to continue on this bill today. A very conscientious piece of legislation that I believe can and should pass this body on a bipartisan basis. The bill before you, as the chairman and ranking member have said, provides $38.9 billion for the department. In such austere budget times, this bill rightly prioritizes spending on programs that save American lives. Frontline protection, terrorism prevention and response, disaster recovery, and a strong and secure border. All of these are paramount to the safety and security of our homeland. Mr. Chairman, we are constantly reminded that we can't let our frontline security efforts lapse. The terrible attack at the Boston Marathon underscored the need to support key readiness programs, provide heroic first responders with the funding and equipment they deserve, and improve intelligence and threat targeting activities so that we can help avoid terrible attacks like Boston in the future. With this bill, we're tightening security at our borders with funding increases for Customs and Border Protection and ICE that preserve the highest totals of Border Patrol agents and CPB officers and the highest detention bed capacity in history. We've targeted funding to combat human trafficking, child exploitation, cybercrime, and drug smuggling. And we're protecting our shores and access points with adequate funding for the Coast Guard and TSA. This bill also fully supports the known requirements from the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund, which provides assistance to localities overwhelmed by catastrophic natural disasters like the recent tornadoes in the Midwest. Our thoughts and prayers, like others, continue to be with the victims of those disasters that have ravaged our nation, like Oklahoma. To that end, this bill provides an additional $6.2 billion for that disaster relief fund. That's for fiscal 14. Right now, though, as the chairman has said, combined with the approximately $11 billion kitty that FEMA has on hand, there is sufficient funding for the immediate response to Oklahoma and other affected areas. And our committee stands at the ready to assess any further needs as a fuller picture of the damage becomes clear. It's our duty as members of Congress to provide this critical assistance to communities that are suffering from such unexpected and devastating natural disasters. Mr. Chairman, strong national security comes at a price. And as we all know, tax dollars for these programs are in limited supply these days. So we can't let any of the funding we appropriate to the Department of Homeland Security go to unproven or wasteful programs. Across the department, we've made careful reductions that bring total funding in this bill to $617 million less than the fiscal 13 enacted level. We've enforced strict reporting requirements and other oversight tools to guarantee that DHS is spending its dollars wisely. And we've prevented funding from being used on risky or controversial efforts like transferring detainees from Guantanamo Bay or another Fast and Furious type program. Now, Mr. Chairman, before I conclude, let me extend my appreciation to Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price, former chairman of the subcommittee, for their hard work in crafting this bill. As has been said by both sides, this is a nonpartisan bill. It always has been that way. We've attempted to work from the very beginning of this subcommittee's existence to work across the aisle to be sure that the homeland is adequately protected. That takes cooperation across the middle aisle, and it's happened over the years, and it's happened this year. And I want to thank these two gentlemen especially for working together as they have. This is John Carter's first bill as a cardinal. He's making his maiden voyage, and I think the ship is sailing true. Judge, he says he hopes so. And we want to thank, of course, the staff of the subcommittee for their tireless hours dedicating toward crafting this bill of great importance to our national security. So I'm proud to say, Mr. Chairman, that I stand before you in 100% support of this bill. It represents all that makes our country great and the security that will keep our country great. And I urge our colleagues to support this bill. And I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Lowy.
Gentlewoman's recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to share the very gracious remarks on the part of the chair of the full committee, the chair of the subcommittee, the outstanding ranking member, and all the staff for the important work you did on this bill. Over the past year, we have experienced the devastation of Hurricane Sandy, heartbreak in Moore, Oklahoma, tragic acts of terror in Boston. Disasters, natural or man-made, pose risks to our communities, which must be matched with the resources of the federal government and in particular the Department of Homeland Security. The bill before us, which is approximately $35 million below the administration's request, does a good job of meeting these tasks, yet inadequately funds other programs, such as operational accounts, which face cuts so severe that they cannot realistically be implemented. I do thank the chairman and ranking member for including several priorities: providing $1.5 billion for FEMA state and local grants, which were underfunded in the request, prioritizing high-risk areas in our grant programs, continuing the securing the city's program to prevent radiological or nuclear attacks, making needed investments in cybersecurity, and including language to help stem sexual assault in the Coast Guard, which has become a significant and outrageous problem in the military. However, the bill before us ignores the dangerous impact of sequestration, putting off difficult choices that must be made if we are to enact responsible spending bills for FY14. With the majority's unworkable 302A allocation, which is $92 billion below the President's request, and less than the amounts agreed to under the Budget Control Act, this is one of the few bills that will have sufficient funding to garner bipartisan support. The budget resolution and appropriations process underway harm our ability to invest in education, medical research, transportation infrastructure, energy development, all of which we need to grow our economy and build a competitive workforce for the future. I was very proud to serve in the Homeland Security Subcommittee and appreciate again the chairman and ranking members' efforts as well as the professional staff in writing this bill. The subcommittee has a history of working across the aisle, and if we avoid poison pill riders during this debate, we will likely pass a bipartisan bill to provide responsible funding levels for the agencies tasked with vital security functions. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlewoman from New York yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to recognize my colleague from the great state of Texas, Mr. Mike McCall, the chairman of the whole Committee on Homeland Security.
Gentleman, how much time? Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
3 minutes.
For 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me thank my dear friend and colleague from Texas, the great state, Judge Carter, and commend him for a fine job on this legislation. The recent Boston attacks serve as a stark reminder that the terrorist threat to America remains constant. Despite the President's dangerous narrative downplaying the radical jihadist threat to America, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates and those they inspire have not given up their quest to attack us. In today's challenging fiscal climate, it is more important than ever that every dollar spent on national security be linked to results. Our safety depends on the strategic funding of programs and technologies that provide us with valuable defenses and measurable outcomes. This bill demands that those criteria be met. As chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, I'm pleased to see this bill provides appropriate funding for our frontline efforts, reins in wasteful spending, and ensures that tax dollars are accounted for by enacting important reporting requirements for the Department. I will soon introduce a cybersecurity bill defining the Department's role in ensuring the real-time flow of information to protect our nation's critical infrastructure, data and intelligence and financial systems. This bill provides the necessary funding needed for DHS to fulfill its important cybersecurity mission. I recently introduced H.R. 1417, the Border Security Results Act, requiring DHS to implement a strategy to gain operational control of our borders. The appropriations bill presented here today supports a strong commitment to secure our borders by providing over $350 million to the Border Technology Account and supports the refinement and adaptation of proven technology needed to monitor the border and support our boots on the ground. The bill provides for an additional 800 CBP officers, $387 million for ICE operations, and funding for ICE's 34,000 detention beds, despite the administration's plan to reduce that number and release hundreds of dangerous criminals into our communities. It also restores cuts to our Coast Guard, which will strengthen our interdiction efforts in the Western Hemisphere. And finally, the bill applies lessons learned from the recent Boston attacks. For example, the bill rejects the President's proposed 39% cut to bombing prevention programs and increases funding for visa security and overstay enforcement programs by $10 million. This bill reflects the right priorities and insists on accountability from DHS. It will help to ensure that America is safe, secure, and protected, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm now pleased to yield 3 minutes to an outstanding member of our subcommittee, Ms. Roybal Allard of California.
For what length of time?
3 minutes.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price for their bipartisan efforts in the drafting of this bill. Unfortunately, with the refusal of the House leadership to go to conference on the budget, this year's appropriations process will be at the expense of essential funding for critical programs such as education, research, transportation, and infrastructure. Nonetheless, this bill will help make our nation stronger and more secure. It robustly funds grants to provide our first responders with the resources they need to protect the public when disaster strikes. The bill also funds the highly effective Alternatives to Detention program at $24 million above the President's request. While I believe ATD should be significantly expanded, I was pleased to see the increased allocation for this proven program. In addition, the bill provides a $16.9 million increase in funding for the Science and Technology Directorate, which will enable DHS to develop new tools to detect and deter terrorists before they attack. However, there are still aspects of the bill that are of concern. For example, the bill continues to mandate that every night ICE maintain 34,000 detention beds even when they are not needed. This needless quota restricts ICE's flexibility in using the smartest, most cost-effective means of enforcing our immigration laws by limiting ICE's ability to base detention decisions on whether or not an individual poses a threat to our country. The bill also increases funding for the ineffective and unnecessary 287G program, which encourages racial profiling and undermines confidence in law enforcement in our minority and immigrant communities. These scarce resources could be better spent addressing serious threats like cyber warfare and cyber crime. Instead, the bill underfunds this critical national priority by more than $24 million below the President's request. In spite of these weaknesses, and given the limited resources allocated to the subcommittee, I do believe Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price have done their best to enable DHS to protect the American people in an increasingly dangerous world. For that reason, I support the bill in its current form. However, I understand some members will try to pass anti-immigrant amendments which would make it impossible for me to support this bill. These efforts are contrary to the bipartisan spirit in which this bill was written and the bipartisan spirit in which this House has always approached issues of national security. If introduced, I urge my colleagues to reject these irresponsible amendments. Again, I thank the Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Price, and the subcommittee's hardworking staff for putting together this bill.
Gentlewoman from California yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to Mr. Adderholz, the former chairman of this subcommittee and currently the chairman of the Subcommittee on Agriculture for Appropriations.
Gentleman from Alabama is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today also in support of FY 2014 appropriation bill for Homeland Security. I want to commend Chairman Carter and also Ranking Member Price for their hard work in making sure that they set up the right priorities during a very difficult budget time here in this nation. The bill provides the resources that are needed to meet our most essential obligations while at the same time maintaining fiscal responsibility and also greater oversight. It is $617 million below last year's spending level. As it's been mentioned, the bill rejects administration proposed reductions in the CBP operations and the Coast Guard and increases funding for critical programs such as TSA Secure Flight Program and the FEMA First Responders Grant. The bill maintains the needed number of beds for ICE detention, and it also includes a substantial amount of funding for NBAF. This important asset provides our nation with critical capabilities to conduct research, develop vaccine and other countermeasures in a time of when we would most need it. So again, I want to congratulate Chairman Carter and Ranking Member Price for their hard work on this bill, and I would urge my colleagues that this is a good bill and this is a measure that should have their support. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Alabama yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to now yield 3 minutes to another outstanding subcommittee member, Mr. Cuellar of Texas.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the Speaker for yielding. I rise in support of this appropriation bill, which includes the hiring of 1,600 new CBP officers. Those are the men and women in blue that man our ports of entry. These 1,600 CBP officers will be a huge and historic step in addressing the congested ports of entries, and I thank the Chairman Carter, and the Ranking Member, Mr. Price, for the leadership and the bipartisan approach on this very important issue. In FY 2012, CBP processed more than 350 million travelers and facilitated $2.3 trillion worth of trade at our ports of entry. America's ports of entry are vital hubs of economic activity, and as high volumes of goods and persons move through our ports of entry, port security is an urgent priority, and therefore this new increase of CBP officers will achieve the goal of facilitating trade, travel, and boost economic development. The southern border is one of the fastest growing regions in North America. In fact, every day there's $1.2 billion of trade between the U.S. and Mexico. Just my hometown of Laredo, that port of entry, it handles about 45% of all the trade between the U.S. and Mexico. In fact, every day there's about 12,000 commercial trucks across the bridges in Laredo. These 1,000 men and women in blue will help facilitate trade and travel at our ports of entry and will help our economy. And I want to thank both the chairman and the ranking member for this effort. Now, we also have to do some enhancements at our critical ports of infrastructure. That's also very necessary. With limited federal funding at our ports of entry, we need to be innovative, and we need to think outside the box. In fact, it's essential that the federal government explore the use of public-private partnership, which allows the federal agency to partner up with local governments and private stakeholders to help fund the land ports, seaports, or airports infrastructure projects. These innovative financial mechanisms with the proper safeguards that we will add will adequately staff, supply, and construct and rehab our ports of entry, and in turn will make our ports more secure and more efficient. I've been working with my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, to encourage the use of public-private partnerships. In fact, I reached out to our colleague in the Senate from the Homeland Security Subcommittee, the chairwoman, Mary Landrieu, and she supports this particular concept. I look forward to working with my good friend, the judge from Texas, which both he and I agree that these are not federal handouts, but it allows the local government to partner up with the federal government and allows us to make our ports more efficient, more effective. I look forward to working with you, Chairman Carter, and with the Ranking Member Price and the staff as we address this conference committee. So I yield back the balance of the time, and I ask you to support this bill.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished member and member of our subcommittee from Pennsylvania, Mr. Dent.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the 2014 Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill being debated this afternoon. I certainly want to applaud the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Rogers, and certainly the chair of the subcommittee, Mr. Carter, as well as the ranking member, Mr. Price, and the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Lowy, for carefully piecing together a bill that appropriately addresses the evolving threats that face our nation. This bill strikes a proper balance of fiscal responsibility while fulfilling the mission of vital security programs and, of course, providing the resources to enforce current law. Regarding fiscal restraint, we're considering a bill today that provides for a reduction in the department's annual budget by $613 million, eliminating ineffectual programs. Yet the legislation was crafted in such a way that agencies and programs will receive the resources and flexibility they need to meet the security needs facing communities across the country day in and day out. For example, in the wake of the Boston bombings this spring, the bill before us restores DHS's bombing prevention program, increasing counter-IED training. The disaster relief fund of the DERF is robustly funded and will meet the disaster needs of the people of Oklahoma, as well as those who were affected by the hurricanes in the Northeast, Hurricane Sandy. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, can I get another 30 seconds?
I yield an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
I just wanted to say one thing, too. The FEMA first responder grants, including fire grants, a program that impacts countless fire departments each year, will receive a 20% increase. Further, these SAFER grants will continue to provide additional flexibility to allow communities to use grants to retain or rehire firefighters facing layoffs. As an aside, I want to thank again Ranking Member Price as well as Chairman Rogers for working with me on this critical issue once again. Bottom line is this is a smart, responsible bill that practices fiscal restraint while addressing our most pressing needs in securing our homeland. I urge support of the underlying bill, and at this time I yield back.
Expired. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, may I inquire as to the remaining time?
Gentleman from North Carolina has 12 minutes remaining. From Texas has 10 minutes remaining.
At this time, I have no further speakers and would like to reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to at this time recognize a member of our subcommittee, a very distinguished member, Mr. Fleshman from the great state of Tennessee, for 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the fiscal 2014 Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. First, I would like to thank Chairman Carter and the subcommittee staff for all the work that they have done in preparation of this legislation. This bill is a perfect example of what happens when real time and thought is put into how taxpayer dollars will be spent. As I have often said, budgeting is about prioritization, and this is exactly what this bill does. The legislation before us today exercises fiscal discipline. As a whole, we will reduce discretionary spending while ensuring that programs vital to our national security are properly supported. This bill also recalibrates the President's pernicious budget proposals for the Department of Homeland Security to ensure that we are getting the most out of every taxpayer dollar. We must ensure the protection of Americans by strengthening security at and within our borders. By streamlining select programs within DHS and implementing stringent oversight, Chairman Carter, the committee staff, with help from Ranking Member Price, have produced a bill that adequately funds our highest security priorities and eliminates waste, fraud, and abuse. Again, I thank the subcommittee for their diligence in crafting this legislation that pays equal heed to the protections of our taxpayer dollars and the security of our citizens. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Tennessee yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield 2 minutes to Mr. Duncan Hunter of the state of California, who is the chairman of the Coast Guard and Maritime Subcommittee of the full committee.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. As the chairman of the Subcommittee on Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation, it is my pleasure to rise today in very strong support of H.R. 2217. Earlier this year, the President released a fiscal year 2014 budget that would cut funding for the Coast Guard by nearly 10% below current levels. This is the second year in a row that this President has asked the Coast Guard to sacrifice mission readiness and success to pay for his questionable spending at other agencies. The President's budget would slash the service's acquisitions budget by 42% below current levels and would severely undermine efforts to recapitalize the service's aging and failing legacy assets, increase acquisition costs for taxpayers, and seriously degrade mission effectiveness. The President's proposed budget points to a future in which a downsized Coast Guard would fail to be able to accomplish even its most basic missions, and the cost could be measured in lives. Fortunately, the bill Chairman Carter has put before us totally rejects the massive cuts proposed by the President and ensures the Coast Guard is provided with the resources needed to carry out its very critical missions. I want to thank Chairman Carter, Ranking Member Price, and staff for their tremendous efforts and their commitment to the men and women of the Coast Guard and the safety of the maritime community. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I'd like to yield 3 minutes to our distinguished colleague, Ms. Wasserman Schultz of Florida.
Gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Mr. Ranking Member Price. First, let me commend both Chairman Culberson and Ranking Member Price on a strong bipartisan bill. But let me especially recognize their leadership for adding language to this legislation to protect our most vulnerable constituents, our children. This language that I refer to will effectively fence off $20 million in funds for child exploitation investigations and forensics within Immigrations and Customs Enforcement's Child Exploitation Investigation Unit at the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Speaker, there is no question that our children need our support now more than ever. With the proliferation of the Internet and wireless technology, the spread of child pornography online must be addressed now. We don't have a moment or an opportunity to waste. The Department of Justice estimates that at any moment there are more than 1 million pornographic images of children on the Internet. Think about that, 1 million, with an additional 200 images being posted every day. And more than 1/3 of the world's pedophiles involved in organized pornography rings worldwide live in the United States. The Internet allows these images to be disseminated indefinitely, victimizing that child again and again with each click of the mouse. Because let's not forget that these aren't just heinous images. They are crime scene photos. Every face in those photographs is the face of a child who needs our support in order to escape a living hell of constant abuse and exploitation. Since the 1970s, before we even had a federal child pornography statute, ICE, which was then called the U.S. Customs Service, was a leader in the fight to protect our children. That is still true today. Last year, there were more than 1,600 criminal arrests relating to child exploitation, and 2,600 worldwide investigations were launched, setting new records for Homeland Security investigations. Already this year, there have been 1,382 criminal arrests relating to child exploitation. Their efforts are second to none, and I know they will continue to put these resources to good use. But for every child rescued, hundreds more remain trapped in a current of abuse, the horrors of which none of us can truly imagine. And we need the absolute best personnel going into the fight to rescue these children. That's why it's my hope that some of these funds will be used to employ our wounded warriors, in addition to the experienced agents already fighting these battles. And I thank the Chairman and Ranking Member for adding report language in the bill to encourage the hiring of these valiant veterans. Our armed services have already protected us abroad, so naturally our veterans are a perfect choice to protect our most precious resources at home. In fact, retired Army Master Sergeant Rich Robertson is already fighting child exploitation at the ICE field office in Tennessee. In his words, who better to hunt child predators than someone who's already hunted men? I'm enthusiastic about this initiative because I know that the immense skills and motivation of our returning servicemen and women the skills that they possess could be the key to our most successful affront on child exploitation yet. Child predators won't stand a chance. By harnessing the abilities of our wounded warriors, we not only ensure that their skills, dedication and drive are put to good use back at home, we give them the most dignified thank you of all, a job that truly makes a difference. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. With the inclusion of this language, we are putting predators on notice. Their reign of terror is coming to an end. You can bet on it. I thank my colleagues on the committee for committing to fight until every American child can live free from terror and exploitation. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Florida yields back. Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I would like to yield 2 minutes to distinguished gentleman from the state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Barletta. He is the chairman of the committee that authorizes FEMA.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank Chairman Rogers and Chairman Carter for putting together a bill that supports communities' ability to prepare for natural disasters in this very difficult fiscal environment. As chairman of the subcommittee with jurisdiction over FEMA, I want to thank them for including all 3 of my committee recommendations in the bill. Thank you for continuing the pre-disaster mitigation program, which saves money in future disaster assistance. Thank you for preserving the FEMA Administrator's authority for directing federal disaster response by limiting the role of the principal federal official. And finally, thank you for funding the Emergency Management Performance Grants, or EMPG. With a 50% match requirement, EMPG grants leverage twice as many preparedness dollars as any other federal program. For 60 years, EMPG has been focused on building local and state emergency management capability. There are plenty of programs that buy equipment and other things, but they won't do much good in major disaster without qualified local emergency managers. We have all seen the photos of evacuation buses, flooded and useless in New Orleans because they didn't have a good hurricane evacuation plan. Emergency managers develop the plans to get people out of harm's way and to bring help from the outside to the disaster area. The EMPG program helps buy that capability, and FEMA needs to keep the EMPG grant guidance focused on building local government emergency management capacity. Again, let me thank Chairman Rogers and Chairman Carter for a good bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania yields back. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve my time.
Gentleman from North Carolina reserves. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I have no more speakers at this time. I'm prepared to yield back.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. During consideration of the bill for amendment, The Chair may accord priority and recognition to a member offering an amendment who has caused it to be printed in the designated place in the congressional record. Those amendments will be considered read. The clerk will read.
Be it enacted, the following sums are appropriated for the Department of Homeland Security for fiscal year 2014, namely Title I, Departmental Management and Operations, Departmental Operations, Office of the Secretary and Executive Management, $103,246,000.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Moore of Wisconsin. Page 2, line 17. After the dollar amount, insert increase by $3,346,000. Page 9, line 17. After the dollar amount, insert reduced by $4 million.
The gentlewoman from Wisconsin is recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to offer an amendment to the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill for fiscal year 2014. My amendment is intended to restore the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties to fiscal year 13 levels by transferring $3,346,000 into the Office of the Secretary and Executive Management. The amendment is fully offset. It's budget neutral. Now, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is an integral part of ensuring that our rights and values are carried out through the Department of Homeland Security. Today, it is even more important than ever to ensure that this office is adequately funded. Now, while this body continues to increase funding for immigration enforcement, and we expect even more funding and personnel to be added in any comprehensive immigration bill that we adopt, it is essential that we maintain adequate safeguards to protect our rights and liberties. I offered a similar amendment last year that sought to provide the office funding that it requested to adequately review these 287G and Secure Communities programs. And I thank the chairman, let me stop to do that now, the chairman and the ranking member for directing $2.39 million to be used for review of these 287G programs. Now, as I mentioned last year, I remain gravely concerned about any 287G programs that have been found to facilitate racial profiling in our communities, that have been found to, that enforcement programs that make it harder for immigrants, especially women, victims, to get help from the police. Now, if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to insist on fully funding 287G programs, as they do here in this bill, $44 million above the President's budget request, and cited as one of the reasons for a White House veto, at the very least, we should have rigorous safeguards and oversight. And I tell you, I must question whether or not we're on a path that recognizes that oversight is paramount as we continue to allow local police to act as federal immigration officers. I mean, the bill increases these programs for review of 287Gs, but I question whether or not we really get it. I'm here today because I disagree with the approach of the bill. Specifically, the bill would cut the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties by 15.5% and then direct the office to pay for this increased review for the 287G and Secure Communities programs by making further internal cuts to other essential areas of their mission. In addition to oversight of 287G and Secure Community programs, the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties provides Homeland Security officials with advice on the full range of civil rights and civil liberties issues. The office engages with communities that are disproportionately impacted by Homeland Security policies and activities. In 2005, the office had regular roundtables with Arab Americans, Sikhs, other Muslims, and other ethnic minorities. Today, they work at 13 core centers around the country. The office investigates detention facilities, violations through site visits to ICE detention facilities to investigate civil rights violations, complaints from the public, oversight of intelligence collection, and as I mentioned, comprehensive immigration reform has a chance of becoming a reality. And we know there's going to be a vast increase of enforcement funding and personnel for this department. But we can't continue to balance essential rights with the security of our country if we play these zero-sum games. It's essential that we adequately fund the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties to implement changes to our immigration law in a way that respects our values of our country that the country was founded upon. Again, my amendment is budget neutral, Mr. Chairman. It only transfers a very small amount, which is vital funding to this $20.6 million office. I urge my colleagues to support this important amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Wisconsin yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is unnecessary since the bill already includes ample funding for necessary oversight of ICE's 287G program. In fact, on page 11 of the bill's accompanying report, it states, including within the amount recommended for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is the total of $2,394,000 for review of 287G agreements and ICE secure communities. And these funds are in addition to the ongoing work of ICE's Office of Professional Responsibility and the DHS Office of Inspector General, who review 287G agreements for compliance. So while I certainly support robust oversight and also demand ICE compliance with all applicable laws and the standards therein pertaining to civil liberties and civil rights, I cannot support additional bureaucracy. Furthermore, the offset of this amendment will cut CBP's automation modernization account, a cut that will impede CBP's processing of trade and result in longer wait times at our ports of entry, which are detrimental impacts to our economy, which none of us can afford to accept. Finally, I think I need to remind members that the President's budget requests decimated operational staffing and enforcement programs. This bill reversed that flawed approach and is holding DHS headquarters resources in check. Therefore, I cannot support an amendment that increases headquarters staffing beyond what is necessary and what can be afforded, and does so at the expense of our economy. Mr. Chairman, I strongly urge my colleagues to support fiscal discipline, support economic growth, and vote no on this amendment.
Texas yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the amendment.
Does the gentleman move to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words and want to express my support for the
gentleman from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
For the amendment of our colleague from Wisconsin to restore funding for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. The bill before us provides $18.3 million for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, which is $3.4 million below the budget request and $3.3 million below current year funding. The amendment would simply restore funding for the office to the fiscal 2013 enacted level. Now, I want to commend Chairman Carter for fully funding the much-needed oversight activities related to the troubled 287G program and to the Secure Communities program. Oversight of these programs is probably the highest priority for this office. But with just a little more funding, as provided in this amendment, we can go further to ensure the protection of civil rights and civil liberties across the Department's many functions, programs, and activities. The Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties is the key mechanism at the Department of Homeland Security for ensuring that the proper balance is maintained between measures to protect the country and the personal freedoms that we cherish. So I thank the gentlewoman for offering the amendment. It's a good amendment, a reasonable amendment, and I urge colleagues to support it.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wisconsin. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment.
Chairman, I would note that a quorum is not present, and I would ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Wisconsin will be postponed. The point of order is withdrawn. What purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Reichert of Washington. Page 2, line 17, after the dollar amount, insert reduced by $2,838,000. Page 42, line 8, after the dollar amount, insert increased by $1,838,000.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 2217. And as a former law enforcement officer, I know very well the needs of first responders. That's why I am proposing that we increase funding for the United States Fire Administration by $1.8 million. This would restore total funding for the administration to the fiscal year 2013 level of $44 million. My amendment is offset by cutting $2.8 million from the Secretary of Homeland Security's Departmental Operation and Administrative account. According to the CBO, the amendment would reduce net budget authority by $1 million and will have no impact on fiscal year 2014 as far as the outlays go. Continued funding for the brave men and women who protect American citizens by fighting fires is extremely critical, as we all know. The fire death rate in the United States is one of the highest in the industrialized world. We can prevent deaths by ensuring that the USFA has better resources. Data collection, public education, research, and training are always USFA's work as they work to reduce the nation's fire death rate. Last year, my district experienced a record devastation from forest fires, fires that quickly burned out of control and threatened both homes and entire communities. Tens of thousands of acres were destroyed, and it took over 1,000 firefighters and volunteers to get them under control. Hundreds of families lost their homes, and it was only due to the valiant efforts of our fire personnel that more were not lost. One of the key roles of the USFA is to work to prepare and prevent those types of fires from happening. They do this by working directly with the local communities and stakeholders. They work to promote the adoption of local codes, protection plans, preventative measures, and much more. They are also a key component of the National Wildland Coordinating Group, which coordinated wildland fire prevention, preparedness, mitigation, and response programs of various federal agencies. They do all of this not just to fight a common natural menace, but to protect lives. I urge my colleagues to support this important amendment endorsed by the International Association of Firefighters, International Association of Fire Chiefs, and the Congressional Fire Services Institute. Together, we can ensure the safety of our first responders and the American people they serve. And I thank the Chairman and Mr. Delane.
Gentleman from Washington yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this amendment and thank Mr. Reichert for his work on this amendment and his care on this issue. This is a bipartisan and common-sense amendment that ensures that we fully fund the USFA so that our firefighters receive world-class training. Fires are not limited to Republican districts or Democratic districts. Fires do not discriminate against rural or urban districts. Fires do not choose between districts on the coast or in our heartland. And thankfully, neither do our firefighters. Firefighters serve us all. Across the nation, when crisis strikes and the flames begin, our brave firefighters rush in. They risk their lives to save ours. We should do everything we can to make sure that firefighters are trained well. That investment will directly result in more saved lives and fewer tragedies. Mr. Reichert has spoken very eloquently and with great care about the benefits of this amendment. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add that one of the keystones of our firefighter education system is the National Fire Academy located at the National Emergency Training Center in Emmitsburg, Maryland. This training center in Emmitsburg is a world-class facility and one of the most important assets in our public safety infrastructure. This is the only federal facility of its kind. This facility is a tremendous public safety asset for our country. Thousands are trained at Emmitsburg each year. In western Maryland, we're proud to train heroes who saved lives from Maine to Washington State, from Minnesota to Texas. This amendment restores funding for our critical training facilities at pre-sequester levels at no cost to the taxpayer. I truly thank my colleague for his work on this amendment, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back. For what purposes does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I rise in support of the amendment.
Does the gentleman move to strike
less words?
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to applaud Chairman Carter for funding the fire administration at a level higher than the administration request, but the bill before us still provides a slight decrease in funding when compared to the current year. So I believe this increase is warranted. The fire administration, as we all know, plays a critical role in training our first responders and enhancing the security of our infrastructure, better preparing the response capabilities of our communities. I do want to register concern, Mr. Chairman, about the offset for this amendment. The money is taken from the Office of the Undersecretary for Management, and this is at a time when departmental management funding is already in this bill $302 million below the request and $147 million below the fiscal 2013 pre-sequestration level. So in dealing with this on the way to conference, we're going to have to pay attention to that offset. However, this is an important amendment. The fire administration is important to all of us, and I urge adoption of the amendment.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I want to congratulate Mr. Reichert for his amendment. I think it's a necessary amendment, and I approve this amendment.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado, page 2, line 17. Under Departmental Management and Operations, Departmental Operations Office of the Secretary and Executive Management, after the first dollar amount, insert increased by $4,359,200. Under U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement salaries and expenses, 1, after the first dollar amount, insert reduced by $43,592,000, and 2, after the sixth dollar amount, insert reduced by $5,400,000.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The 287G program has become increasingly controversial and increasingly recognized as a costly failure. By allowing local police officers to effectively act as federal agents and immigration officials, it not only increases crime by taking local cops off the beat, not only costs taxpayers money at a time where we have an over $600 billion deficit, but it also creates fear in Latino community and in other immigrant communities. 287G exacerbates tensions, interferes with community policing and the efforts of law enforcement to gain the trust of people in the communities that they need to be able to do their job well. In effect, it's trained local law enforcement officials to use racial profiling, asking community members where they're born or if they're in this country legally. Now, the 287G program has become infamous because of the implementation in Maricopa County under Sheriff Joe Arpaio and his racial profiling. The practices sanctioned under 287G have led to an unprecedented civil rights investigation by the Department of Justice and an independent civil suit. Even Sheriff Arpaio has acknowledged that the Department of Homeland Security directed him and his officers to use racial profiling as part of their policing practices in identifying individuals for deportation. You know, if Sheriff Arpaio is citing a federal expenditure as a justification for his actions, there must be a problem with that federal expenditure. And in fact, there is. In the fiscal year 2014 bill, the House Appropriations Committee has funded 287G at $44 million above the White House request. The White House has even threatened to veto the Department of Homeland Security appropriations bill, listing as one of their concerns that, in fact, the 287G program has been largely replaced by other enforcement mechanisms like secure communities. Well, now, we don't all agree on secure communities, but there's increasing consensus on all sides of the aisle that 287G has no place in our communities or in our budget. It doesn't help combat illegal immigration. In fact, it makes it worse and increases crime in our communities. This amendment will allocate 10% of that funding to the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties and 90% towards deficit reduction. By seeking to cut funding for a program that relies on racial profiling and increases crime, we're sending a clear message that we won't tolerate any more Arpaios, we care about the budget deficit, and we want to cut wasteful government spending. Programs like 287G have created mistrust between Latino and our immigrant communities throughout this country and local law enforcement, and interfered with community policing. Eliminating 287G once and for all will begin to repair the trust that's been lost over the last decade. It'll help local law enforcement fight crime instead of trying to implement failed federal laws, and will be a step forward in the ultimate goal of this Congress, fixing our broken immigration system, restoring the rule of law so that we can grow our economy and decrease crime. This amendment is very simple. It would save $44 million from a wasteful government spending program, allocate just over $4 million of that to address some of the cuts that have been made to the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and use the bulk of that for the deficit reduction account. Let's come together, Democrats and Republicans, to go ask for wasteful government spending and counterproductive government spending, as it is in this case, and I strongly encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this bill.
Gentleman from Colorado yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Robust enforcement of our nation's immigration laws is critical to our national security. Clearly, 287G program supports that goal. Under 287G programs, ICE enters into a partnership with state and local enforcement agencies and authorizes them to remove criminal aliens who are a threat to local communities. In effect, the program acts as a force multiplier and ensures more resources to enforce immigration laws and policies. In fact, since the January of 2006, the 287G program is credited with identifying more than 279,311 potential removable aliens, mostly at local jails. ICE cross-designation of more than 1,500 state and local patrol officers, detectives, investigators, and correctional officers allows them to pursue a wide range of investigations such as human smuggling, gang or organized crime activity, and money laundering. In addition, participating entities are eligible for increased resources and support from more remote geographic locations, support at those locations. Currently, ICE has 287G agreements with 75 law enforcement agencies in 24 states. Utilizing the funds as an offset takes resources from local sheriffs, police officers, and other first responders and puts it in the hands of bureaucrats at DHS headquarters. And while I appreciate the gentleman's suggestion that the deficit is too high, I reject his choice of balancing the budget by jeopardizing public safety and law enforcement. To his point that the deficit must be reduced, let me point my colleagues to other provisions in the bill that instills fiscal discipline by cutting departmental administrative expenses and bureaucratic overhead by nearly 25% and by denying the President's request to create 2 new offices. For these reasons, I oppose the amendment, urge the members to join me in opposition, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. For what reason does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the gentleman from Colorado's amendment. The gentleman's amendment eliminates increased funding in the bill for the critically flawed 287G program, and it increases funding for the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. I want to support the gentleman on both of these fronts. As our colleague has noted, the 287G program, designed to facilitate cooperation between federal and local authorities in immigration enforcement, has in fact proved prone to serious abuse. It's fundamentally flawed in the way it blurs the line between federal and local roles in immigration enforcement. Moreover, it simply wastes money. It's very, very costly. The cost to the taxpayer of the per removal in the task force model of 287G, that cost is especially outrageous, $32,789 per removal. And you compare that to only $1,500 per removal under the more workable and more appropriate to Secure Communities program. So not only is 287G flawed and prone to abuse, it's also simply a waste of taxpayer dollars, and it's increasingly redundant as the Secure Communities program takes effect. The gentleman is redirecting money, I think, in a useful way to the Office of Civil Rights. It's the most important activity of that office is to oversee this problematic 287G program as well as Secure Communities. And the funding level in the bill is short of the request. It's short of the current year's funding, and so with a little more funding, we can enable the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties to do its job in a much better way. Now, ideally, Mr. Chairman, this amendment would address serious other shortchanged areas of the bill. For example, cybersecurity, Coast Guard acquisitions, human trafficking, Secret Service. We can think of a lot. I would like to see some of those things addressed, as well as the deficit reduction item. But I believe this amendment greatly improves this bill, both in the money it saves and in the money it redirects, and I urge its adoption, and I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. For what reason does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the Polis-Chu-Cardenas amendment to strike federal funding for the 287G program. 287G is a misguided program. While it claims to help enforce our immigration laws, it actually diverts critical law enforcement